She came to the cafe and offered her gold in exchange for food, but the single father told her something completely different. See how it all ended. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road stretched endlessly before her, a strip of dust and heat shimmering beneath the merciless sun. Each step felt heavier than the last, her legs dragging as though her own body conspired against her. She had long ago stopped counting the days since she had left the place that could no longer be called home. Hunger gnawed at her stomach with a steady cruelty, and her throat ached with dryness that no sip of water could soothe. Her clothes hung loosely from her body, worn and faded, patched so many times they bore the story of every hardship she had endured. The once dark fabric had been bleached by the sun, and the hem was frayed, brushing against her ankles with every faltering step. Around her shoulders was a shawl that had once belonged to her mother, threadbare and thin, but clutched tightly against her as if it still carried protection. Against her chest she kept a small pouch hidden beneath the folds of her clothing. Inside were the few pieces of gold she had left, an old ring with a tiny, dulled stone, a pair of earrings that had lost their shine, and a slender chain that had belonged to her mother. They were not jewels of wealth, but of memory, fragments of a life now buried under loss. Every time her fingers touched the pouch, she felt both a flicker of comfort and a surge of pain. Comfort, because these were all she had left of her family. Pain, because she knew what she was preparing to do with them. For days she had resisted the thought. To part with them seemed unthinkable, as though handing them away would erase the last traces of the people she had loved and lost. She remembered her mother's hands fastening the chain around her neck on her 12th birthday, her father smiling when he gave her the earrings as a token of pride, her husband slipping the ring onto her finger with vows that the world would later break. Each object carried a weight far heavier than its gold, a weight of memory and dignity. To give them away for food felt like betrayal, not only of the dead but of herself. Yet the sharp edge of hunger had dulled her resolve, grinding her pride down day after day until nothing remained but the urgency of survival. The first time she considered selling them, her chest had clenched with shame. The second time, she wept in silence beneath the indifferent stars. Now walking toward the faint outline of a settlement ahead, she pressed the pouch to her chest and forced herself to accept what she had once thought impossible. She whispered to herself in the privacy of her mind that this was not surrender, only necessity. But the thought did little to soften the ache that swelled in her throat. When she finally reached the edge of the settlement, the smell of cooked food struck her with almost violent force. She paused, leaning against the weathered wall of a building, her breath ragged, her head light. The sense of bread, of stewed meat, of warmth and abundance poured into her senses like cruel reminders of what she had lacked for too long. She steadied herself, wiped her hands against her dress, and walked toward the source. It was a modest cafe, little more than a wooden door set into a faded facade. The sign above it had letters half erased by weather, but she could make them out enough to know it offered food. Inside, the dim light of late afternoon filtered through narrow windows, painting the room in soft amber. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped in, and for a moment she felt all eyes on her. There were only a handful of patrons, weary men with hats pushed back on their heads, bowls of stew in front of them, their conversations hushed. They glanced at her quickly, then looked away. She knew what they saw, a woman in tattered clothing, skin darkened by sun and struggle, eyes that carried exhaustion as plainly as her worn shoes. Behind the counter stood a man. He was broad-shouldered, with arms marked by years of labor, and his presence filled the room with a quiet authority. His face bore lines of responsibility rather than age, and his gaze was steady, assessing her as she hesitated by the doorway. There was no hostility in his expression, but neither was there welcome. It was the look of someone accustomed to caution. In the corner of the room, sitting at a small table with a stub of pencil in hand, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 8 years old. Her skin was the same shade as the man's, her hair braided into neat rows, her dress simple but clean. She bent over a scrap of paper, drawing shapes with an intensity that belonged to children who carried quiet worlds inside them. Now and then, she lifted her eyes to her father, and the faintest smile touched her lips. But otherwise she stayed silent, lost in her task. The woman's steps carried her forward almost against her will. Each movement seemed louder than the last, and when she reached the counter, she felt her heart pounding so violently that she feared it would betray her desperation aloud. She lowered her eyes to the surface of the wood, afraid to meet the man's gaze too directly. Then with trembling hands, she reached into her clothing and drew out the small pouch. Her fingers clutched it so tightly that her knuckles whitened, and for a long moment she could not release it. It was as though something inside her screamed to keep hold, to turn back, to endure hunger rather than cross this boundary. But the hunger won. She opened her hand, and the pouch fell onto the counter with a soft sound. The faint clink of gold within it seemed louder than all the murmurs in the cafe. Slowly, carefully, she untied it and pushed it forward, revealing the ring, the earrings, the chain. They caught the dim light, flickering briefly before settling into dull reflections. The man's gaze lowered to the objects. He studied them without expression, his large hand hovering near but not touching. His daughter, sensing something, raised her head from her drawing and looked curiously toward the counter. For the woman, time stretched unbearably. She felt exposed, as though the whole room had been stripped open to witness her humiliation. In her mind, the voices of her mother and her husband echoed with disappointment. She thought of the promises she had made never to let these pieces leave her possession, and now she was breaking them for bread. Her chest tightened. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She clenched her fists and forced herself to breathe evenly, to appear as though this act were merely practical, not devastating. "I offer this for food," she thought silently, though her lips never shaped the words aloud. The man's face remained unreadable. At last he lifted his eyes to hers, and something in his expression shifted. He reached forward, not to take the gold, but to push the pouch gently back toward her. The gesture stunned her. She blinked, uncertain. Her breath caught. In that moment, he seemed to weigh more than just the metal before him. He studied her with a depth that went beyond suspicion, as though seeing the outline of her struggle, the dignity still clinging stubbornly to her even in this moment of surrender. His eyes flicked briefly toward his daughter, then back again. She waited for rejection, for scorn, for dismissal. Instead, his voice, calm but firm, broke the silence of her anticipation. He told her he did not want the gold. It would not feed his daughter or keep the cafe alive. What he needed was not metal but presence, someone who could share the weight of his burden, someone who could stay and work. The words hung between them, heavier than the gold on the counter. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a trade, not a proposition. Confusion surged, then suspicion. Was this pity? Was it mockery? Or was it something else she had not dared imagine? Her body tensed as if ready to retreat. She wanted to grab the pouch and run, to leave the cafe and the man with his unreadable eyes. But she could not. The hunger that had driven her here tightened its grip once more, a cruel reminder that she had little choice. She nodded faintly, unable to trust her voice, and the decision sealed itself in silence. That night she lay in the small storeroom behind the cafe, curled upon a thin mattress that smelled faintly of flour and wood. She pressed the pouch of gold against her chest, holding it as though it were a heartbeat she could not afford to lose. The humiliation still burned within her, but hunger had been kept at bay, and she told herself that this was enough. Yet as she drifted into uneasy sleep, she wondered if she had entered a prison of necessity or the fragile beginnings of something else. The first light of morning crept into the storeroom where she slept, drawing pale lines across the wooden floorboards and falling upon the rough mattress that had carried her through the night. She awoke with a heaviness still clinging to her body, the kind that no amount of rest could wash away. The air smelled of flour and dust, faintly sweet but also suffocating, and for a moment she lay still, clutching the pouch of gold against her chest as though it might vanish if she let go. The memory of the previous evening returned with painful clarity. The counter, the man's gaze, the pouch being pushed back toward her, and his calm voice refusing the gold, yet offering something stranger, something she had not expected. She felt the sting of humiliation again, the silent scream of pride that told her she should have left. But the stronger truth was undeniable. Hunger had led her here, and hunger had bound her to his offer. When she rose, her limbs ached as though they carried the burden of years rather than days. She brushed off her dress, straightened her shawl, and stepped into the quiet of the cafe. The room was empty, chairs stacked atop tables, the smell of last night's stew still lingering faintly in the air. Behind the counter, the man was already at work, sleeves rolled up, a cloth slung over his shoulder. He looked at her once, a brief flicker of his eyes, then returned to his task without words. She understood it as a command more than a greeting. She was not here to be pitied. She was here to work. She began with the simplest tasks, those that required no instruction. She fetched water from the pump outside, her arms straining with the weight of the buckets as she carried them back. She wiped the tables, scrubbed the stains that had seeped into the wood, swept the floor until the dust rose and settled again. The broom felt strange in her hands at first, but as the hours passed, her body fell into rhythm, into the steady flow of labor that left little room for thought. Yet beneath the silence, a tension lingered. She knew he was watching her. Every movement she made, every step across the floor, she felt the weight of his eyes as if he were waiting for a mistake. By midday, the cafe had opened its doors to the first customers. Men trudged in from the road, women with baskets stopped for bowls of soup, the chatter rising and falling like the hum of bees. She moved among them quietly, clearing dishes, bringing bread, pouring water, her presence barely acknowledged. Now and then someone glanced at her clothes, the tiredness etched upon her face, and she felt their judgment pierce her. Yet she did not falter. She kept her head bowed, her hands steady. Work was work, and for the first time in many days she had a place to belong, however temporary, however fragile. The man said little. He cooked with efficiency, moving between pot and pan with the practiced certainty of someone who had done this for years. His daughter sat again in the corner, the same scrap of paper before her, her pencil scratching quietly as she drew. At times her eyes flickered toward the woman, curious, wary, but she quickly bent her head down again whenever she was noticed. The distance between them was palpable, a gulf that neither dared cross. The woman did not approach her, did not attempt to speak, though she longed to. She understood too well the silence of children who had known loss. To force closeness upon her would be another wound. So she kept her distance, offering small glances of gentleness, hoping that one day they might be returned. As the days unfolded into a quiet pattern, the woman began to feel the rhythm of her new life. Morning meant sweeping and scrubbing. Afternoons brought the bustle of customers. Evenings ended with cleaning and the dull ache in her muscles that strangely comforted her. Work filled the spaces where hunger had once lived. Yet in the solitude of the storeroom, she still held the pouch of gold against her chest, her fingers tracing the shapes within. Each night she whispered to herself that she would not give it away. Not now. Not unless the world left her no other choice. The thought of surrendering those pieces still felt like a betrayal she could not bear. But she also knew the man had been right. The gold would not feed her, would not keep her standing. Only her labor would. The man's watchfulness did not fade quickly. He spoke little, but his eyes lingered on her, measuring. It was not cruelty, but suspicion, the instinct of someone who had learned the cost of trust. She noticed how he locked the register drawer, carefully each night, how he counted the coins with deliberate slowness, his back turned, yet ears alert. She knew he expected her to prove herself, though neither of them had said it aloud. At times, resentment stirred in her, resentment that she, who had already lost so much, was still forced to earn belief in her honesty. But she buried it beneath silence, the same silence that had carried her through hunger and grief. There were moments, small and fleeting, when she caught glimpses of something softer in him. Once, when the cafe grew crowded and her arms were full of dishes, he stepped forward to help, his hand brushing hers as he took a tray from her grasp. Another time, she saw him pause at the doorway of the storeroom late at night, as if checking to see whether she slept safely, though he said nothing and left without a sound. These moments confused her as much as they comforted her. She did not know whether they were signs of acceptance or mere habit, the instinct of a man used to carrying responsibility for everyone under his roof. The daughter remained distant. She watched with wide, cautious eyes, always observing but never engaging. The woman noticed how the girl's small fingers clutched her pencil too tightly, how she drew the same shapes over and over: houses, trees, figures that seemed incomplete. Sometimes the child's gaze fell on her with something close to longing, but the moment passed quickly, replaced by guarded withdrawal. The woman understood. Trust did not grow overnight, not in children who had learned to protect themselves with silence. She did not push, did not intrude, but she left small traces of kindness where she could. Folding a napkin neatly before the girl, placing a slice of bread nearer to her side of the table, leaving a smile unspoken but visible in her eyes. With each passing day, the cafe itself seemed to shift beneath her hands. The dust on the floorboards gave way to a faint shine from her scrubbing. The tables, once sticky with neglect, now carried a clean warmth. Even the air smelled different, fresher, the mingling scents of herbs and bread more pronounced. Customers began to notice. They lingered longer, spoke more cheerfully, left behind fewer complaints. Business, though still modest, seemed steadier, as if her presence had woven some small thread of order into the place. Yet despite these changes, she never allowed herself to feel secure. At night, when the shutters closed and the cafe lay silent, she lay awake in the storeroom, with the pouch pressed against her chest. She thought of her mother's voice, of her husband's touch, of the life that had collapsed into ashes. She reminded herself that nothing here was permanent, that she was still a stranger in this house, tolerated but not embraced. The man's eyes still measured her. The girl's silence still held her at a distance. She worked because hunger demanded it, not because she belonged, or so she told herself. But beneath the surface, changes were quietly taking root. The man's watchfulness began to soften into something less guarded. His daughter's silence held flickers of curiosity rather than avoidance. And within the woman herself, the ache of humiliation began to shift, not vanish, but transform into a different kind of weight, the weight of possibility. It was fragile, uncertain, easily broken, yet it was there. The days continued in their pattern, and though she still carried the gold close, she began to notice that she reached for it less often. It no longer felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to life. Her hands, raw and calloused from work, had found a new kind of purpose. The cafe had not yet become home, but it was no longer just a shelter. It was a place where she could stand, if only for a little while longer. And so the first days passed, heavy with silence, lined with suspicion, but slowly, imperceptibly shaped into something more. The woman did not yet see the changes for what they were, but the seeds had been planted. Hunger had brought her to the cafe, but work was beginning to bind her to it, thread by fragile thread. The days unfolded into weeks, and the rhythm of life inside the cafe began to shape itself into something almost familiar. The woman who had first stepped across the threshold as little more than a desperate stranger now moved with a steadiness that gave the place a new order. She cleaned before the customers arrived, prepared vegetables with practiced hands, carried water, washed dishes, and tidied every corner until even the air seemed lighter. Though she still felt the heaviness of her past each night when she clutched the pouch of gold to her chest, the daylight hours were filled with work that distracted her from despair. What had begun as an act of humiliation was slowly, invisibly, turning into a quiet threat of survival. The man no longer watched her with the same sharp suspicion. His eyes still measured, but they no longer lingered with doubt. Instead, they followed her movements with a restrained acknowledgement, as though he had begun to accept that her hands belonged to the daily order of the cafe. He still spoke little, but there were fewer barriers in his silences, fewer pauses heavy with distrust. For the woman, this shift was not dramatic but steady, like the soft thaw of frost on a window pane. She noticed the difference in how he allowed her to move freely, how he no longer checked the tables after she wiped them, how he began to leave tasks for her without explanation. It was a kind of trust, though quiet and unspoken. It was the little girl, however, who marked the truest change. In the beginning, the child's eyes had followed the woman with suspicion, wide and cautious, as though measuring whether this newcomer was a threat or a passing shadow. She had hidden behind her drawings, her silence building a barrier thicker than words could. But the barrier began to weaken in the small, unnoticed spaces of everyday life. The woman had not forced herself into the child's world. She had worked quietly, leaving small offerings of kindness without expectation. A slice of bread set near the child's side of the table, a napkin folded neatly within reach, a subtle glance of warmth that asked for nothing in return. The girl noticed. Children notice more than adults expect, and though she never spoke of it, the child's eyes softened, the suspicion replaced by a cautious curiosity. One afternoon, while the woman was cutting vegetables at the counter, she sensed the child nearby. The girl had left her corner and inched closer, her footsteps timid, the hem of her dress brushing the floor as she hovered at the edge of the counter. The woman did not turn at once. She continued slicing the carrots, steady and calm, giving no sign that she expected anything. And then slowly, a small hand reached forward and placed something on the counter beside her. It was a doll, worn and missing an arm, the fabric frayed and the paint on its face faded by years of love. The girl did not say a word. She left it there and stepped back, her dark eyes shining with a guarded hope. The woman looked down at the doll, and her heart tightened. It was not just a toy. It was an offering, a fragile bridge from one soul to another. She did not touch it immediately. Instead, she continued with her work, allowing the child to see that her gift had been received without being claimed too quickly. Only later, when the girl had returned to her seat, did the woman gently place the doll back within reach, her hand brushing the child's lightly in the process. The child did not flinch. That single moment, more than any words, changed the silence between them. From that day on, the girl began to drift nearer. She lingered by the stove to watch the woman stir the pots, asked with her eyes rather than her voice if she could carry a small basket of bread, and stood beside her long enough to learn the simple rhythms of kitchen work. The woman, careful never to overstep, guided her with gestures and patience. She saw in the girl's movements the longing for connection, the cautious steps of a child who had been denied the comfort of a mother's presence for too long. Slowly, the invisible wall between them began to crumble. The man noticed. He saw his daughter smiling again, faintly at first, then more freely. He heard her laughter on rare occasions, the kind of sound he had thought lost since the day grief had entered their home. Watching her draw near to the woman awakened something within him, something he had kept buried beneath labor and silence. He realized that the stranger he had taken in, whom he had expected to be nothing more than a set of working hands, had become a gentle presence that brought his child back to life. Though he did not speak of it, his eyes softened when he looked at the woman, and his shoulders carried a little less of the heaviness he had borne alone for so long. The cafe itself reflected these changes. The air inside no longer carried only the scent of food, but also the warmth of companionship. Customers felt it too. They noticed the brightness in the girl's face, the quiet harmony between the man and the woman behind the counter, the way the room seemed fuller even when it was nearly empty. Some lingered longer over their meals, enjoying the comfort that radiated from the place. Business began to improve, not because of grand gestures, but because people were drawn to the atmosphere of quiet healing that seemed to inhabit the cafe. Through it all, the woman still kept the pouch of gold. At night she pressed it to her chest, whispering to herself that she would never surrender it, that it was hers to guard, the last trace of her family's memory. But she began to notice something strange. She no longer reached for it out of desperation. Instead, it was a habit, a ritual that reminded her of where she had come from, but no longer defined where she was. During the day, her hands were too busy with work, too full with the tasks of caring for the cafe and its people, to cling to the past. She realized slowly that the pouch no longer represented salvation. It was no longer her only chance to survive. Instead, it had become a symbol of what she had endured and what she carried forward. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cafe emptied of its last customers, she stood at the doorway, watching the father and daughter together. The girl was showing her father the drawings she had made, her face alight with pride, and the man was nodding, smiling faintly, his hand resting on her shoulder. The sight stirred something in the woman that she had not felt in years, a warmth that spread through her chest, a fragile sense of belonging. It frightened her as much as it comforted her. She was still wary, still haunted by the thought that all of this could vanish, that she was only a shadow passing through. Yet for the first time in her long road of hunger and loss, she felt as though she stood on the edge of something real. The days that followed deepened this fragile bond. The girl now followed her willingly, fetching cups, handing her spoons, even laughing when flour dusted her nose in the middle of kneading dough. The man allowed himself small moments of rest, knowing there was someone he could rely upon in the rhythm of the cafe. And the woman herself felt her own burden lighten, not because her past had disappeared, but because her present had begun to take shape. She knew that she was still an outsider, still bound by the uncertainty of her place here. But the warmth that had begun to blossom around her was undeniable. It filled the spaces hunger had hollowed out. It softened the sting of humiliation she had carried when she first offered her gold. And it gave her something she had not dared to hope for, a fragile, growing trust. The weeks had turned into months, and the quiet rhythm of life in the cafe deepened into something that felt almost unshakable. The woman no longer moved like a stranger, measuring each step with caution, but like someone whose presence was woven into the very fabric of the place. Her hands had found their patterns, her body its strength, and the weight of constant suspicion that had once followed her. Every movement had faded into silence. The man no longer watched her with wary eyes, and the little girl had long since abandoned her corner of solitude to hover close to the woman, eager to help in small tasks, her laughter echoing faintly in the air that once knew only stillness. Yet as calm as the days had become, there came a time when all three of them would be tested, when the bonds they had begun to form would prove whether they were strong enough to hold or fragile enough to break. It began quietly, in the way many hardships arrive. A few customers did not come. The roads, usually busy with travelers, seemed emptier, as if the world beyond the town had withdrawn its interest. The shelves in the market grew barer, and the prices of simple goods rose higher than expected. By the end of one long week, the cafe stood quieter than it had in months, with chairs waiting for occupants who never arrived, and pots that simmered for no one. The woman noticed the lines of worry deepen on the man's face. He counted the coins in the drawer with slower, more deliberate hands. His brow furrowed as though each coin mocked the effort it represented. He tried to hide it from his daughter, but the child, perceptive beyond her years, noticed the tension in his shoulders and the heaviness in his silences. The woman, too, felt the shift. She had been carried by the sense of belonging that had begun to take root in her heart. Yet now she feared it might all collapse as quickly as it had been built. Each night she lay awake in the storeroom, clutching the pouch of gold against her chest, wondering if the moment had come when she would finally have to surrender it. The thought filled her with dread, not only because the gold was the last relic of her family, but because giving it away now felt unnecessary, even hollow. It would not fix the emptiness of the cafe, nor the rising prices, nor the silence that had crept in through the door. For the first time she saw the pouch for what it was, a weight of memory, but no longer a salvation. The man, though burdened, did not falter. He rose each morning to light the stove, to chop the vegetables and prepare the bread, even when he suspected no one would come to eat it. His pride would not allow him to close the doors. The cafe had been built with his own hands, and it had carried him through loss before. Yet there were moments when his eyes lingered on the woman with something close to fear, as if he believed she might decide to leave now, to walk away while she still could, while she still carried her gold. The thought gnawed at him, though he never gave it voice, but she did not leave. On the contrary, she worked harder than before, her hands moving with determination even when the task seemed endless and without reward. She swept and cleaned, she baked bread, though few would eat it. She prepared meals with care as though the cafe were still filled with customers. When he looked at her, he saw not hesitation but resolve, and something in him shifted. The gold she carried no longer threatened him. It had become irrelevant. What mattered was the truth written in her actions, that she had chosen to stay, even when the world gave her every reason to go. The little girl, too, clung closer in those days. She followed the woman like a shadow, carrying small dishes, brushing crumbs from tables, sitting beside her in the evenings while they folded linens together. Her trust, once given cautiously, had grown into something steady and sure. Where once her eyes had carried only sadness, they now held a light that flickered even in the quietest moments. She no longer needed drawings to fill her silence. She had voices around her, a presence that made her feel safe again. It was on one particularly hard evening, when the cafe had sat empty from morning until night, that the change became clear. The three of them gathered around a small table with the simplest of meals: bread, a bowl of thin soup, and water. The man's face was grim, but he forced himself to eat with dignity. The girl sat beside him, leaning against the woman, her small hand resting on the woman's arm. The woman looked at them both and felt a surge of something she had not known in years, a sense of home, fragile but real, built not on wealth or certainty, but on shared struggle. Later, when the cafe had gone dark and the shutters were drawn, she returned to the storeroom. She sat on the edge of her mattress and opened the pouch of gold. The pieces gleamed faintly in the candlelight, their dull shine whispering of the past. She traced the chain with her fingers, held the ring between her thumb and forefinger, let the earrings rest in her palm. She remembered her mother's hands fastening the clasp, her husband's voice as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the echoes of promises that had long since been broken by death and loss. The gold was sacred, yet it no longer held the power it once had. It was no longer her shield against hunger. It was not her only tether to life. She placed the pieces back into the pouch and tucked it deep beneath her things, not to offer it, not to surrender it, but to keep it as what it had become, a symbol of memory and strength, not of desperation. In the days that followed, something in the cafe shifted once more. The emptiness of the rooms did not change overnight, nor did the struggles of keeping it alive vanish. Yet the three of them faced it together, and that made the difference. Customers began to return slowly, drawn back by the same warmth they had once found there. They spoke of the steadiness of the place, of the way it seemed untouched by despair, even in the hardest times. Word spread, and people came not only for food, but for the feeling of comfort that lived within its walls. One evening, as the cafe filled with the hum of conversation once again, the woman moved among the tables with a grace that surprised her. She no longer felt the heavy cloak of humiliation that had once weighed her down. She no longer thought of herself as a beggar who had traded dignity for survival. She had become part of something larger, something that mattered not only to her, but to the man and his daughter. The little girl now smiled openly when she looked at her trust complete, her laughter a gift that filled the air. The man, though still reserved, carried himself with a lighter step, his eyes softening whenever they met hers. That night, when the last customer had left and the chairs were pushed back into place, the three of them sat again at the small table. But this time the meal was fuller, the bread thick, the stew rich and steaming. They ate together in silence, but it was a silence filled not with emptiness, but with belonging. The woman looked around her, the child leaning against her side, the man across from her with his steady presence, and realized that she no longer measured her worth in gold. She no longer feared the pouch would have to be given away. She had found something far more valuable, something that could not be bought or sold. The cafe was modest, the night still uncertain, the work unending. Yet in that simple room, she felt the weight of a truth she had thought forever lost. She had found a place where her hands, her heart, and her spirit were needed. She had found in the quiet trust of a child and the steady strength of a man the beginnings of a family. The gold remained with her, but it was no longer her salvation. It was only a memory of the path that had brought her here, to a table where bread was broken and warmth was shared. And in that warmth, she discovered what hunger had stolen from her and what humiliation had almost erased. She discovered that she was no longer a wanderer clutching at relics of the past. She was part of a home, fragile but real, born not of wealth but of trust, and built on the quiet strength of staying when she could have walked away. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.